you're stuck taking the same bird photos over and over, this video will change that. Many wildlife photographers face two struggles. They fall into repetitive patterns, same birds, same poses, same compositions, or they feel paralyzed because they don't know what else is out there to create. And I get it, because I spent over a year trapped in bird portraits before I discovered there were 10 distinct bird phototypes I could intentionally pursue. That discovery completely transformed my photography. My portfolio became diverse, and I finally knew what I was creating before I even picked up my camera. So today I'm breaking down all 10 types of bird photos organized in 5 clear groups. This is the most comprehensive guide to bird photography types you'll find anywhere, and will expand your creative toolkit. So we'll start with photos where the subject is the star, then zoom out to include environment, next add action and movement, then explore how birds interact with the human world, and finally push into creative experimentation. This goes beyond simple documentation of birds. This is about intention and strategy, not gear. So by the end, you'll know exactly what to create on your next shoot and have a complete roadmap to diversify your portfolio and keep your bird photography exciting. So let's dive in. Let's start with the foundation, photos where the bird itself is the star of the show. The portrait is the classic bird image that captures its character and distinctive morphological features. We're talking about the whole bird, visible in frame and also occupying a significant part of it. In the bird portrait, what really matters is the bird pose, because we want the bird in a pose that shows its natural character and its major features, for example, the bill, any specific colors, or a distinctive tail. Also, sharpness is extremely important, especially at the eye and face. And also, we need a clean background, simple, uncluttered, so the bird really stands out. Now, these are really classical bird photos, so it's kind of easy to fall into repetitive and predictable shots. Sometimes this is referred to as birds on a stick syndrome, said in a kind of negative way. However, these aren't boring unless you're shooting on autopilot. So remember, every bird species has personality, so your job is to wait for the moment when it shows through. And something that can also really elevate this photo is finding a nice colored background. Now, obviously, I recommend pursuing portraits when you have close access to cooperative birds and when light is soft and directional, because normally for a portrait we don't want any strong shadows or strong bright areas in our image. Portraits are also perfect for building a portfolio that attracts viewers, because people just love a good portrait. Now, the portrait shows you the whole bird, but what happens when we get even closer and start revealing things we normally wouldn't see? That's where super close-ups that show details and textures come in. Here, we are cropping into part of the bird, in most cases, the upper part of the body with the head, the eye, and the bill. So this isn't about showing a bird anymore, it's about revealing micro-level beauty and characteristics of a bird. For example, in this super close-up of a northern gannet, the goal was to have a photo where the viewer could fully appreciate the cobalt blue of the orbital ring. Or in this shot of an oyster catcher, you can fully appreciate the orange bill, the red eye, and the orange eye ring. Now, with this kind of bird photo, extreme sharpness is even more important, because at this magnification, any softness is obvious. These images also really make people stop, because they never seen a bird like that, so a close-up is excellent for attracting viewers. Now, these first two types, portraits and super close-ups, will require one thing, which is being really close to birds or have a really long lens. And that's not always possible in bird photography, and I'm sure you know, and distance is definitely one of the major reasons of frustrations for bird photographers all over the world. So what do we do when we can't get close to the birds? Do we give up? Of course not. We need to learn to embrace the distance. So let's see what happens when we take a few steps back and we include the word around the bird. So the next two types of bird photos are all about making distance work for you, creating more unique images others might miss. And let's start with environmental photos. Environmental bird photos are those where the habitat becomes a core component of the image. Now, too often bird photographers underestimate the importance of habitat, because if it wasn't for that, the bird wouldn't been there in the first place. So I think that's definitely something worth including in our image. For example, a swan on a misty lake at dawn, a bittern hiding in reeds, a gull floating in a pond, or a goldfinch in a sunflower field. Now here, composition is crucial because you're balancing two visual elements, your subject and the habitat. So the environment should tell us something about the bird's life. Also, in these images, the bird is often smaller in the frame, so it occupies a smaller part of the image, so you need to guide the viewer's eye just there. Now, obviously, these type of images can be more challenging on a technical side because you have more elements to manage, so not only the subject anymore, but also the foreground and the background. But despite these challenges, this is also where storytelling happens, because these images answer the questions: where does this bird live and how does it interact with its world? Now, the common challenge for this image is finding balance, because if you have too much environment, the bird gets lost. If you add too little, it's just a portrait with a bit too much clutter around. So you need both elements to work together. Now here I want to share a personal story. So for the first year of my bird photography, I've been shooting only portraits, and I clearly remember that day when I was in some wetlands. There were great egrets and herons that were far away, and when I took this photo, I remember checking the back of my camera, and for the first time I realized I actually liked the surroundings and how the reeds created an interesting visual pattern with their repetition. So after some attempts changing the composition, I did something that back then sounded completely crazy, because I zoomed back. So I went to what became my final image taken at 400 millimeters. Now, this definitely isn't the most remarkable bird photo ever, but taking this image that day was liberating for me, because for the first time I realized I didn't need to always be super close to birds if I could only learn to intentionally see and include the habitat. And that moment changed everything, and from that moment onwards I definitely moved away from the standard portrait. And talking about photos where the subject is small in frame, there is another type I define atmospheric bird photo. Here the scene is dominated by negative space, and that's the core difference from environmental photos. So in the environmental bird photo, we can tell where the bird is because the habitat is clear. In atmospheric bird photos, negative space creates the mood. But what's negative space? By technical definition, the negative space is everything so blurred it doesn't have any details, so it's not an anchor for the viewer. Now, these images prioritize feeling over documentation, and achieving this type of photo requires either really close foreground elements or really distant backgrounds, using shallow depth of field to create this dreamy, soft quality. The other ingredient is environmental conditions like fog, mist, golden light, or dramatic sky. Remember also here the bird is a compositional element, and especially because it's small, it needs to be placed in an intentional way in the frame so it doesn't get lost. So in a world where standard bird photography is about chasing proximity, here we're being revolutionary because we're embracing distance and we're using it to create emotion and mood. These type of images tend to feel more like paintings, and they are mostly associated with a sense of calm, almost contemplation, and this also requires a completely different mindset to create, I think. Now, often you can be very far to create this image, and again, this can be totally liberating. So remember, distance doesn't have to be a limitation. It can be a storytelling tool and a way to create something more unique and magical. So far, we've looked at photos where the bird is the absolute main subject, but also how to include more of the surroundings. Now, let's add movement, because birds don't just stay still, but they have pretty dynamic lives. So if we think about photos with action in bird photography, the first thing that comes to mind is obviously birds in flight. Now, birds in flight are extremely popular as a bird photo type because the fact that birds fly is one of the major reasons why humans are so fascinated by birds. Now here, we want extreme sharpness unless you're intentionally doing motion blur or panning, and you need to pay attention specifically to the wing position because we want the wings at peak position, not that awkward mid-flap. Now, obviously, achieving a bird in flight photo comes with its own challenges because tracking movie subjects sometimes is easier said than done because birds move fast and also not in a really predictable manner in many cases. The other thing is that birds are often high overhead, and we also need fast shutter speeds to freeze the action, which means we need to have enough light available. And there's also the risk of the kind repetitive gray blue sky background. Now here, when it comes to birds in flight, my major tip is to practice when you have more subjects because it's just very difficult to build this skill if you just have a bird occasionally passing above you. So look for groups of birds so you will have more subjects and more chances to practice your tracking abilities. And also try first with larger subjects because they're just easier to work with at first. So don't attempt your first bird in flight session by trying to track swallows because I'm pretty sure that won't work. Now, when we talk about action, the first thing that comes to mind is flight. But in reality, there are many more behaviors that birds have, and this is actually one of the reasons I find birds so interesting in the animal world. Now, when we talk about behavior photos, we are capturing a specific moment, the peak of action that also tells a story. Now, there are so many behaviors, and here I want to try to give you a general overview, providing also some examples. So let's start with all the behaviors related to food. Also, just when we think about foraging, there are so many different strategies that birds use to look for food. Or if we think about hunting from birds of prey, let's think about kleptoparasitism, like in this photo with skuas stealing a fish from a tern. But my absolute favorite behaviors to capture are those related to reproduction and parental care. And we go from courtship, nesting, mating, incubation, feeding the youngs. This is why I really can't wait for spring because it's such a great season for bird photography because we witness all these incredible behaviors. Now, obviously, we also have a bunch of behaviors related to communication. Birds do many different types of vocalizations. Let's think about a photo of a bird singing. But birds communicate also with their bodies. So with wing positions, there's also different displays and signs of aggression. And if you want a great chance to see many social interaction behaviors, I recommend you to visit a seabird colony. Then we also can think about movement behaviors because flight isn't the only way birds move. Now, depending on the species and on the moment, some birds might walk, swim, dive. And finally, we also have the self-care behaviors like preening. I also find preening images so relaxing to watch because it's such an intimate moment, but we also have sunbathing, resting, sleeping. So with behavior photos, there's so much variety to capture, and the really important thing here is timing. So capturing the behavior at its peak, like the moment the bill is more open during singing or wings fully open during an aggressive display. And generally, we want sharpness to freeze the decisive moment. Now, the beauty of behavioral bird photos is that these images have narrative. They're the moments you remember from photography sessions because they answer what was this bird doing, not just what does this bird look like. Now, the challenge with this type of bird photo is that it requires patience and also anticipation because you need to read bird behavior and predict what's coming. Now, this is also where building those skills about really learning about your subjects and their behavior really makes you a better photographer, because by understanding behavior you will be ready when the moment happens because you're not just reacting but you're anticipating. Now here, something else to mention is that obviously with behaviors involving multiple subjects like aggression or parental care, you have more things to organize in your frame. So this means that you have more elements to take into account on both the compositional level but also for the sharpness level. Now, after action, we move to two other types, focusing on the relationship between humans and birds. Let's start with urban bird photos. Now, these are birds in human environments, so alongside buildings, man-made objects, just urban settings. Now, we're often told to avoid these elements, but reality is that birds have adapted to live with humans. So there's a story to tell in that relationship. Sometimes it's harmonious, sometimes it's conflictual, but it's there. Now, the human element must be clear and intentional, not something that accidentally happens to appear in a frame. So here, again, one of the struggle of this bird phototype is finding order in sometimes really chaotic scenes with loads of elements. Now, on the storytelling perspective, these images are really powerful because these images show the adaptability of birds, their resourcefulness, the changing relationship between wildlife and urban spaces. So, for example, let's look at these wood pigeons living under the tufel, or a kestrel resting on top of an old farmhouse building, or a swan against the light of a houseboat. And now we move to another phototype, which is a conservation bird photo. So this is when we want to use photography as a tool to tell stories about species at risk, threats they face, or conservation efforts to protect them. So these go beyond the aesthetics because there's a clear message behind it. So you want to find a story worth telling, and you can include human elements like people. You can have a single image or a sequence, and generally it's really important that these images should make viewers feel something but also understand the message that these photos are telling. Now, for example, one conservation story I worked on is about the Kentish plover, which is an endangered species here in Italy, with the population dropping by more than half in the last decades. But the region where I'm originally from remains a stronghold for the species, and the numbers are increasing. And this year, for the first time, Kentish plovers have been ringed through a national program, and this will give us much more information on their migratory journeys and also how to better protect them. So remember, your camera can be more than a tool for pretty pictures. It can also be a voice for species that need one. Now, we've covered the most traditional bird phototypes, and now we give ourselves permission to break every rule because we're talking about creative photography. A brilliant way to start experimenting more with your photography is to go black and white. Because going black and white, we are simplifying a scene by removing colors. So normally for these photos to work, you need a good tonal range from black to white, and it works best if you have strong light and shadows, interesting textures, or whenever color would distract from the story or mood. Honestly, black and white is not a type I do a lot, but maybe I need to do more of it. It's also raining while I'm recording these videos. Apologies, I need to clean my glasses. Anyway, I was saying that my creativity flows more with the next type, which basically includes everything that is really creative. So this is a big bucket because here we find any non-traditional bird photos. So this can be achieved via different techniques. One of these is intentional camera movement, also called ICM. Now, as bird photographers, we obsess about sharpness and crispy details, and ICM is literally the opposite. And that's why I actually love it, like really going against everything that you think about bird photography. And these are some of the results obtained via ICM. Now, there are also other advanced techniques like in-camera multiple exposure. You can also play with more creative compositions like unusual perspectives or zoom in super details, for example, revealing the textures of feathers at a point where it becomes an abstract pattern. There are also ways to go creative thanks to post-processing editing. So, for example, going for a high-key look or a low-key look. Now, all these techniques really prioritize artistic expression over the realistic accuracy. So here it's all about your creativity and your vision. You have to have the willingness to experiment and fail. Also give yourself the permission to make images that might look wrong to traditional bird photographers. So here my recommendation is just focus on what makes you happy. And this is all about expressing yourself. And overall, I really recommend everyone to do some more experimental and creative bird photography because experimentation is how you keep photography joyful. Now, before we wrap up, I want to cover one final bird phototype that I think every bird photographer knows really well, and that's the bird bath. I'm not sure I can say but on YouTube. I hope I can. But that's the photo where the bird shows you its rear end. And often happens, when the light is perfect and the perch is perfect. It's like they know. So yeah, everyone has hundreds of bird bath photos. This is just a rite of passage for every bird photographer. Anyway, coming back serious, because yeah, this was a really serious video and we covered a lot. And here are 3 things I want you to remember. The first one is that blurred lines are okay. So obviously here, for the sake of education, I try to find categories, but it's totally normal that photos might fit multiple types or they might just sit across 2 types. So obviously don't get hung up on rigid definitions. Use these 10 types as a guide. It's not a rule book. The second important point, and the reason why I made this video, is that variety and experimentation is what really keep photography exciting. So if you're stuck in a rut taking the same portraits over and over, challenge yourself with environmental, atmospheric, or behavior shot. You might realize you don't like the type as much as portrait, but experimenting develops new skills that I'm sure you'll bring back to your main type. And also experiment outside your comfort zone, because that's where growth happens. The third important point is don't just follow trends, but find your voice. So this is why I really wanted to present all the bird photo types that are out there, because popular doesn't mean better. So just because the portrait and super close-ups or bird in flight tend to get loads of likes on social media, it doesn't mean that's what you should focus on. For example, I love environmental and atmospheric photos. I know they don't work well on Instagram because you see them on a small screen and you can't appreciate the sense of scale that those images evoke, but I take photos for myself and not for others. So that's why I keep taking those photos. So here's what I want you to do. Look back at your whole photo archive and think which type dominates. And most importantly, is there a type that maybe you're avoiding or something that you've never tried? Drop a comment and let me know, because I want to hear what you're going to experiment with next. So remember, now thinking about these photo types, you can use them to think intentionally about what you're creating, because you're capable of so much more than just documenting what a bird looks like. Now go out there and take some great bird photo. And now that you know which type of photos you want to create, maybe you want to check this video where I show how to edit them. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe if you can, and I'll see you for the next video.